Summer 1944, Normandy countryside. A German intelligence officer sits inside a quiet farmhouse, studying a map spread across a wooden table outside. The war is moving fast. But inside this room, everything feels still. His entire responsibility is to predict where the Americans will strike next and by. Every standard, he has everything needed to do it. Radio, intercepts, aerial reconnaissance photographs, reports from informants in nearby villages, and even prisoner interrogations that reveal fragments of American plans. Yet, despite all of this, he cannot answer the one question that matters. He looks at the map again, tracing roads, slowly trying to imagine possible routes, trying to find some pattern, some logic, something that makes sense, but there is nothing there. American units appear in places that do not make sense. They attack when they should retreat, and they disappear before any response can be organized. At first, he assumes it is coincidence, then he questions his intelligence sources, but slowly, he realizes something far more dangerous. The Americans are not following any predictable pattern, and that realization changes everything, because intelligence depends on patterns. If you understand how your enemy thinks, you can predict his next move, and if you can predict his next move, you can stop him before he acts. But what happens when there is no pattern? What happens when the enemy does not follow any rule you recognize? The officer writes a report. It is careful, detailed, and honest, stating clearly that American reconnaissance units cannot be predicted. They behave in ways that do not match any known doctrine. They move with a level of freedom that makes them impossible to track. This report will later be captured, translated, and stored in the U.S. National Archives, but in that moment, it is simply one man trying to explain something he does not fully understand. By September, he will watch entire German panzer formations get destroyed, not because they were weaker, but because the Americans always seemed to know just enough. They knew where to be, they knew when to strike, and more importantly, they knew when to disappear. German soldiers begin using a word for them, not official, not written anywhere, but spoken quietly among themselves. They call them ghosts, because they appear from nowhere, strike with precision, and vanish without a trace. But this is not a story about ghosts. It is not about luck or coincidence. It is about a completely different way of thinking about war. And to understand it, we need to go back to a time when the American army was not feared at all. Early 1943, North Africa, the Kasserine Pass, where American forces faced the German army for the first time in a major battle, and the result was a disaster. Units were disorganized, communication failed, commanders lost control, and soldiers fought bravely, but without direction. German forces moved with confidence, exploiting every weakness, and the Americans suffered heavy losses. For German commanders, this battle confirmed their belief that the American army was inexperienced, predictable, and easy to understand. They studied the battle carefully and built a clear picture of how the Americans operated, and they were confident that this understanding would hold true in future battles. But they made one critical mistake. They assumed the Americans would not change. What they did not see was what happened after the battle ended, because the Americans did something very different. Instead of hiding the failure, they studied it. They analyzed every mistake. They wrote detailed reports, not about heroism, but about what went wrong and why it went wrong. Commanders were replaced, systems were rebuilt, training was improved, and most importantly, their entire way of thinking was questioned. This process was not easy. It required admitting weakness, it required breaking old habits, but it created something powerful. Because while the Germans believed they had already understood their enemy, the Americans were quietly becoming something completely different. To understand why American reconnaissance became impossible to predict, you first need to understand what the Germans expected reconnaissance to be. Because in their system, everything had a clear role and a clear limit. German reconnaissance was designed to observe, not to interfere, to gather information without becoming part of the battle itself. Units would move forward carefully, maintaining contact with the enemy, while avoiding unnecessary engagement. If they encountered resistance, they would pull back, report the situation, and wait for heavier forces to act. This system was logical, structured, and most importantly, predictable. And that predictability allowed German intelligence officers to build patterns, to analyze movements, and to anticipate enemy decisions. But the moment those patterns disappeared, the entire system began to fail. And that is exactly what happened when the Americans changed the way reconnaissance worked. By 1944, American cavalry units had transformed into something entirely different, built around fast armored vehicles like the M8 Greyhound, which could move quickly across long distances, operate quietly, compared to heavier machines, and maintain communication through reliable radio systems. But the real difference was not the equipment, it was the mindset. These units were not told to avoid combat, they were told to create information, and that single change redefined everything. Because information in war does not only come from watching it. It comes from interaction, from pressure, from forcing the enemy to react. American reconnaissance units would move forward aggressively, and if they encountered an opportunity, they did not hesitate, they attacked, not because they were stronger, but because action revealed more than observation. A quick ambush could create confusion, capture prisoners, disrupt movement, and expose weaknesses in a way that passive observation never could. And just as quickly as they appeared, they would disappear, leaving behind chaos and unanswered questions. German officers began reporting that American units behaved unpredictably, appearing behind lines, striking supply routes, and vanishing before a response could be organized. These were not large, coordinated assaults. They were small, fast decisions made by officers on the ground, lieutenants and sergeants acting independently, without waiting for higher command. Approval and this level of decentralization was something the German system was not built to handle, because their structure relied on controlled decision-making and clear chains of command, where information flowed upward and decisions flowed downward. But the Americans had broken that structure. They allowed decisions to be made at the lowest level, turning every small unit into an independent problem-solving force. And this created a situation where no two encounters looked the same. Sometimes a patrol would engage aggressively, sometimes it would withdraw instantly, sometimes it would push deep into enemy territory, and sometimes it would disappear entirely. There was no fixed pattern, and without a pattern, there was nothing to analyze, nothing to predict, and nothing to counter. German intelligence officers, who had been trained to look for order, found only uncertainty, and uncertainty in. War is dangerous because it forces hesitation. When a commander does not know what the enemy will do next, he cannot act with confidence. He must slow down, reconsider, and prepare for multiple possibilities at once. And this consumes time, resources, and attention. American reconnaissance did not just gather information, it forced the enemy to spread his forces thin, to guard more territory, to prepare for attacks that might never come. And that pressure created opportunities elsewhere, because while the Germans were trying to understand what they were seeing, the Americans were already moving to the next position, already making the next decision, already shaping the battlefield in ways that could not be predicted. And this is where the real shift happened. Because reconnaissance was no longer just about seeing the battlefield, it was about controlling how the battlefield would unfold. And the Germans, who relied on structure, logic, and predictability, suddenly found themselves facing an enemy that operated outside all three. While American cavalry was turning the ground war into something unpredictable, something even more powerful was happening behind the front lines. A unit unlike anything the German army had ever faced was being built not to fight in the traditional sense, but to control what the enemy believed to be true. This was the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops, a group of soldiers who did not look like soldiers at all. They were artists, designers, engineers, radio specialists, men who understood perception more than firepower. And their mission was simple, but incredibly dangerous. They were going to manipulate the enemy's intelligence system from the inside. Instead of hiding their presence, they would create a false reality and allow the Germans to discover it for themselves. Because information that appears to be discovered is far more believable than information that is hidden. And this is where the concept of deception became a weapon on a completely different level. The unit developed three primary methods, each designed to target a different part of German intelligence. The first was visual. They built inflatable tanks, artillery pieces, trucks, and entire vehicle formations from rubber and canvas, carefully painted with realistic details and positioned in open areas where aerial reconnaissance would capture them from above. From the air, these fake units looked completely real, even to trained analysts studying photographs. The second method was sound, using advanced recording equipment. They captured the noises of real military operations, tanks, moving engines, running bridge construction, soldiers organizing for movement, and then played these sounds through powerful speakers at night, projecting the illusion of activity across large distances. German listening posts would pick up these sounds and report troop movements exactly where the Americans wanted them to be detected. The third method was radio deception, and this was perhaps the most sophisticated of all, because radio operators were trained to mimic not just the signals of specific units, but the unique rhythm and style of individual operators. Every experienced radio operator develops a pattern in the way they transmit signals, almost like a fingerprint, and the Germans relied heavily on recognizing these patterns to identify units in the field. So when American deception teams replicated these patterns, Perfectly German intelligence believed they were listening to real divisions operating in real positions. Combining these three elements created a system where multiple sources confirmed the same false information. Aerial reconnaissance saw the unit's ground listening posts heard the activity, and radio intercepts confirmed their presence from three independent angles. And when three independent sources agree the information is considered reliable, this is exactly what the Germans experienced, except none of it was real. Entire divisions appeared to exist where there were only a few hundred men. And based on this false reality, German commanders made real decisions. They moved troops into defensive positions, aimed artillery at empty ground, and prepared for attacks that would never come. This was not simply deception, it was control, because the Americans were no longer reacting to German intelligence. They were actively shaping it, feeding it carefully designed information that produced predictable reactions. And once this process began, it became extremely difficult to stop, because deception, once believed, cannot easily be questioned. Every new report reinforces the previous one. And over time, the entire intelligence system becomes unreliable. German commanders began facing a new problem. They could no longer trust what they were seeing or hearing. Every piece of information carried doubt. Every report raised questions. And when an army cannot trust its own intelligence, it loses the ability to plan effectively. It becomes reactive instead of proactive, and this shift is critical, because in war, the side that reacts is always at a disadvantage. American deception units did not need to win battles directly. They only needed to create confusion, delay decisions, and force the enemy into hesitation, and hesitation opens the door for real attacks happening elsewhere. While German forces were preparing for threats that did not exist, American units were moving freely, striking real targets and gaining ground without facing the resistance they would have encountered if the enemy had accurate information. This combination of unpredictable reconnaissance and controlled deception created a battlefield where the Germans were always one step behind, not because they lacked skill or experience, but because the information they depended on had been compromised, and in war, compromised information is often more dangerous than no information at all, because it leads to confident decisions based on false reality, and confident mistakes are the hardest to recover from.